In the spring of 2021, near the quiet border between Missouri and Mark Twain National Forest, a farmer was moving a feeding trough for his deer when he stumbled upon something that made him freeze. Beneath the damp soil and blocks of salt, there was something pale at first. He thought it was an animal bone. But when he knelt down for a closer look, everything around him fell silent. It was a human skull belonging to a teenage boy who had been missing for 23 years. Police soon confirmed that the remains belonged to Robbie Andrews, a 17-year-old who had vanished back in 1998 after leaving home for what was supposed to be a simple day exploring the woods. No one ever learned what happened to him that day. Robbie had been a bright young man, full of curiosity and a love for nature, the kind of boy who found peace among trees and rivers. But that morning's journey became the last trip of his life. 23 years later, when the skull was found at a deer feeding site, one haunting question still echoed through the Mark Twain forest. What really happened to Robbie Andrews? Robbie Andrews was 17 that summer, young, restless, and full of that fragile mix of innocence and independence that often defines the final stretch of youth. He lived with his parents in the quiet town of Van Buren, a place surrounded by farmland and endless green, where nights were still enough to hear crickets from a mile away. To most people, Van Buren was ordinary, but to Robbie, it was a cage he longed to step beyond. He wasn't the type to rebel or draw attention. He was quiet, thoughtful, often spending hours with his sketchbook, drawing maps and forest trails from memory. He loved hiking, camping, and photographing wildlife, especially deer. His mother often said he had an old soul, someone who belonged more to the woods than to crowded streets. Friends described him as dependable, calm, and deeply curious about how the world worked, but that curiosity sometimes led him far from safety. By the end of September 1998, as autumn brushed the edges of Missouri with orange and gold, Robbie began planning a solo trip into the Mark Twain National Forest, a place he had visited several times before with his father. He told his parents he wanted to spend a day taking photos of early fall leaves and testing a new compass he'd received for his birthday. It wasn't unusual for him to explore alone. He always came back before dark. So, on the cool morning of the 26th of September, 1998, he packed his old canvas backpack, a notebook, a map, his camera, a water bottle, and a pocket knife. Then, with a wave from the front porch, he headed toward the forest trail that began a few miles from home. That was the last time anyone saw him. Later, his mother would recall how peaceful the morning had been, the kind of quiet that feels almost too perfect. She remembered the smell of rain in the air and how Robbie had said he'd be home by evening to help his father repair the barn roof. There was no reason to worry then. But as dusk fell and the first chill of autumn crept in, his absence grew heavier. By 8 p.m., when Robbie still hadn't returned, his father drove to the edge of the forest, expecting to find him by the main road. Instead, he found only the trailhead empty and silent, with no footprints leading out. At first, everyone believed he had simply lost his way. Searchers combed through the trees with flashlights, calling his name until their voices cracked. The local sheriff organized a team of volunteers, and the next morning, helicopters swept across the canopy. Within hours, they discovered his bike leaned neatly against a tree near the trail entrance, unlocked, untouched. That discovery changed everything. Inside the small basket on the bike were a few candy wrappers, a folded map, and his wristwatch, stopped at 10:42 a.m. That single detail puzzled investigators. Why would Robbie leave his bike, and why was his watch removed and tucked away as if he had intended to come back soon? The area where he vanished wasn't known for crime. There were no reports of dangerous animals or suspicious strangers that day. Yet the forest itself, vast, ancient, and filled with ravines and sinkholes, had swallowed people before. Those who searched said it was like chasing shadows in a maze of trees that all looked the same. Days turned into weeks. Each new lead led to another dead end. Eventually, the teams withdrew, and Van Buren returned to its quiet rhythm. But for the Andrews family, time never moved the same again. Their boy had disappeared into the trees, and the forest, it seemed, had no intention of giving him back. By the second night, the town of Van Buren had changed. Porch lights stayed on long past midnight, and the soft hum of engines echoed from the forest road as search teams came and went. No one had seen Robbie since Saturday morning, and the silence surrounding his absence was starting to feel unnatural, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Dozens of volunteers gathered at dawn, some carrying lanterns, others clutching thermoses of coffee that had long gone cold. Among them were Robbie's parents, standing quietly by the sheriff's truck as a deputy reviewed the search map pinned against the hood. The plan was simple: start from the trailhead, move east in grid formation, and comb every ravine, clearing, and creek bed along the way. At first light, the woods looked almost beautiful. A light mist curled through the oaks, and sunlight spilled in thin gold ribbons between the trees. But beneath that calm exterior was an unspoken tension, the kind that comes from knowing someone is out there, somewhere, waiting to be found. Sheriff Dan Heller, who led the search, later recalled the eerie stillness of those first few hours. The dogs picked up a faint scent along the main path, leading toward a narrow ridge less than a mile from where Robbie's bike had been left. There, the trail split in two. One road continued toward the river, the other descended into a dense patch of undergrowth. Searchers followed both. By noon, one team discovered a small clearing where it seemed someone had stopped briefly. Scattered on the ground were footprints, a few candy wrappers, and what looked like the imprint of a backpack. But there was nothing else, no camera, no notebook, no sign of struggle, just traces that led nowhere. The following day, a light rain swept across the forest, washing away what little evidence had been found. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights cutting through the mist, while volunteers trudged through mud and tangled roots. Every shout of "Robbie" was swallowed by the trees, returned only as faint echoes. When the third day came, the search expanded beyond the marked trails. Local hunters guided officers toward deer paths and hidden gullies where outsiders rarely ventured. They found an old fire pit filled with wet ashes and a half-burned stick recent enough to still smell of smoke. It gave everyone hope for a moment, but the optimism faded quickly when tests showed it wasn't recent enough to belong to Robbie. Meanwhile, reporters began arriving, drawn by the growing mystery. For a town that had rarely made headlines, the attention felt surreal. But the Andrews family didn't care about cameras or interviews, they just wanted their boy back. Robbie's mother refused to leave the search site, sitting by the ranger's station with his favorite jacket folded on her lap. As hours turned into days, the official search grew more desperate. Teams used infrared imaging, drones, even divers to check nearby creeks. Nothing appeared. It was as if Robbie had simply walked into the forest and vanished between one breath and the next. But one discovery stood out, and it would linger in the sheriff's memory for years. On the fourth evening, just before sunset, a volunteer spotted something half buried under a fallen log near the northern ridge. It was a torn piece of denim fabric, the same color as the jeans Robbie had been wearing that morning. Next to it lay a small notebook, water-damaged, but still intact enough to reveal a few faint pencil lines, sketches of leaves, a compass symbol, and 3 words written shakily across the last page: "Follow the creek south." No one knew what it meant. Investigators spent the next week scouring every stream that cut through the forest's southern edge, but the trail ended abruptly at a flooded ravine. Beyond that point, no further traces were found. By October, after nearly 2 weeks of relentless searching, the official operation was scaled back. The case was classified as a missing person under unexplained circumstances. The volunteers went home, the search tents came down, and Van Buren tried to return to normal, though nothing felt normal anymore. At night, people said you could still hear the faint sound of someone calling out deep within the woods, a single voice carried by the wind, fading into the dark. Some believed it was just imagination. Others thought it was Robbie's spirit, lost between the trees that had become both his refuge and his tomb. But for his parents, there was no mystery in what they felt, only absence and the weight of an unanswered question that would haunt them for the next 23 years. Autumn faded into winter, and then into the long quiet of the years that followed. The case of Robbie Andrews slowly drifted from headlines to whispers, another unsolved story in a small Midwestern town that had seen too many heartaches and too few answers. For Robbie's parents, life became a cycle of waiting. Each morning began the same way, his father reading the newspaper by the window, pretending not to glance toward the road. His mother standing by the kitchen sink, watching the tree line beyond their fence. They never said it aloud, but both listened for footsteps that never came. The house remained almost untouched. Robbie's bedroom stayed as it had been that September morning, his school books stacked neatly, the old map pinned to the wall, the hiking boots still by the door. Dust gathered, but nothing was moved. His mother refused to change a single thing, afraid that altering the space might somehow erase the faint traces of him that still lingered in the air. Every year, when the anniversary of his disappearance came around, the Andrews family placed a candle on the porch and walked to the edge of Mark Twain forest. They would stand there for hours, leaving a small bundle of flowers and a note weighted with stones so it wouldn't blow away. Some years they went alone. Other years, a few neighbors joined quietly, offering comfort in silence. The sheriff's office reopened the file several times over the next 2 decades, usually after a hiker or hunter reported finding something unusual, a scrap of clothing, a shoe, or a bone fragment. But each time the lab tests came back negative. Every discovery ended in disappointment. Robbie's story began to blur into local folklore. New families who moved to Van Buren heard about the boy who went into the woods and never came out. Children dared each other to walk the trails at night, and older residents warned them not to. To the townspeople, it was a mystery. To his parents, it was a wound that never closed. As years passed, even time seemed to grow tired of offering hope. Robbie's father aged quickly, his hands rough from years of work but trembling whenever someone mentioned his son's name. His mother's hair turned gray, yet she still kept a plate for him at the dinner table during holidays. She said it felt wrong not to. There were moments when life almost returned to normal, short breaths of peace that vanished as soon as they came. Every ringing phone, every knock at the door, rekindled the same fragile spark of hope, followed by the same quiet heartbreak. By 2020, 22 years had slipped away, and the Andrews family lived with a kind of stillness that only those who have lost someone without goodbye can understand. Robbie's mother began keeping a journal, writing letters she knew would never be read. Her words were soft, simple, always ending the same way. "We'll keep waiting, sweetheart. Just find your way home." Then, one cold morning the following spring, the phone rang again. But this time, it wasn't another false lead or empty rumor. This time, it was the sheriff's voice, older now, slower, hesitant. He told them a hunter had found something deep inside the forest, near a place where people sometimes left food for deer. After 23 years of silence, the woods had finally spoken. It was early spring when the forest finally gave up its secret. The air was cool that morning, quiet enough for every rustle of leaves to sound like a whisper. A local hunter named Mark Heller had gone out before sunrise, his boots sinking into the soft ground as he followed a narrow path toward his feeding station, a small clearing he maintained every year for the deer that roamed through Iron County's woods. He noticed something unusual before he reached the trough. One of the salt blocks he had placed weeks earlier was overturned, half buried in mud. Scattered nearby were tufts of animal fur and broken twigs, signs that deer had gathered there recently. But what caught his eye wasn't any of that. It was the pale, round shape, just beyond the feeding spot, lying among fallen leaves and branches. At first, he thought it was the remains of a deer. The forest was full of bones after winter. Still, curiosity drew him closer. He crouched, brushed away the dirt, and froze. The shape wasn't an animal skull. It was human. Mark stumbled back, heart pounding. He fumbled for his phone and called the sheriff's office, barely managing to get the words out. Within an hour, Police cars lined the trailhead. Yellow tape went up, and the quiet woods turned into a scene of tense investigation. Sheriff Dan Heller, the same man who had led the original search for Robbie more than 2 decades earlier, arrived in person. Time had aged him, his hair now gray, his eyes tired, but the memory of that case had never left him. As he walked toward the feeding site, the forest felt heavier, as if it too remembered. The skull was resting near a shallow depression, surrounded by fragments of decayed wood and torn leaves. A few feet away, officers found what appeared to be a piece of weathered fabric, a strip of faded denim. Heller didn't need to say a word. Everyone there knew what it likely meant. Forensic teams worked carefully, collecting every trace they could find. Beneath the layer of soil, they uncovered several small bones, fragments of a belt buckle, and a rusted chain with a tiny pendant still clinging to it. The initials engraved on the back were faint but unmistakable: R.M. That night, the sheriff drove back to his office in silence. He didn't call the Andrews family right away. He waited until the DNA results came in, though deep down, he already knew. 2 weeks later, confirmation arrived. The remains belonged to Robbie Andrews, missing since September 1998. When the call finally came, his parents didn't cry at first. There was a stillness on the other end of the line, the kind that only comes after years of unanswered prayers. Then his mother whispered, "So he really was there, all this time." News spread quickly through Van Buren. For a town that had carried this wound for so long, the discovery brought both sorrow and strange relief. People gathered outside the Andrews home, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten notes. Some thanked the family for never giving up. Others simply stood in silence, unsure what comfort could ever be enough. The investigation continued in the following weeks. Detectives returned to the feeding site, mapping out the area where Robbie's remains had been found. It was more than 12 miles from the spot where his bicycle had been discovered, deep in a section of forest that few people ever entered. The terrain was rough, marked by ravines and dense thickets. Investigators theorized that he may have gotten lost while trying to follow the creek south, as his final note suggested. Perhaps exhaustion, hunger, or injury had forced him to stop. Wild animals or flooding might have scattered his belongings over time. But there were details that didn't fit. The pendant's chain was broken in a way that suggested force, not decay. The torn fabric appeared cut, not ripped. And most unsettling of all, a hunter recalled seeing an old wooden shack not far from that spot years ago, before it collapsed into the earth. No one had been able to find it since. The sheriff never confirmed whether that cabin was searched again, but locals began to whisper about it. Some said it was an old trapping hut. Others claimed a recluse once lived there in the late 1992. Whether it had any connection to Robbie's fate remained unknown. Forensic specialists could determine only one thing with certainty. The skull had lain undisturbed for decades, shielded by layers of soil and leaves, until erosion exposed it once more, as if the forest had decided it was finally time to return what it had taken. When spring turned to summer, the Andrews family held a small service in the town cemetery. Friends and neighbors stood beneath gray skies as Robbie's mother placed a hand on the casket that held what little remained of her son. Her voice trembled when she spoke. "He always loved the woods. I just wish they had loved him back." And with that, the case that had haunted Van Buren for nearly a generation was finally brought to rest, though for many, peace would never fully come. The forest had answered one question, but left behind 100 more. As the shock of the skull discovery spread through the small mountain town, new questions rose like ghosts that refused to rest. Who had left Robbie Andrews, a cheerful 17-year-old boy with his whole life ahead of him, to vanish without a trace? And why had his remains surfaced, decades later, in such a strange, haunting place, a deer feeding site deep within the forest? Detectives, locals, and amateur investigators all tried to make sense of it, each forming their own unsettling theory. The first and most immediate assumption was the simplest one, that Robbie had gotten lost. Back in 1998, he was known to be adventurous, often taking detours on hiking trips to capture photos of wildlife and landscapes with his old film camera. Maybe he had strayed too far, wandered off the trail, and succumbed to the unforgiving wilderness. But even those who believed this version of events admitted that something didn't add up. Robbie's hiking gear was never found. No backpack, no clothes, no camera, and most importantly, no sign of an animal attack. It was as if he had simply dissolved into the woods. Another darker theory emerged as investigators studied the site more closely. The location where the skull was found wasn't random. The deer feeding area was built only a few years after Robbie disappeared, meaning his remains had been there long before it existed. Whoever placed them there had likely chosen the spot intentionally, a place animals would frequent, ensuring scavengers might scatter evidence. Some locals whispered that Robbie hadn't just gotten lost. He had been placed there. The idea of human involvement, an abduction, a violent act, or even ritualistic motives spread quickly among residents who remembered the unsettling rumors that had circled the woods in the late 1992. Then there was the theory involving the Old Ranger Trail, an abandoned path less than a mile from where the skull was found. It had once been used by hunters and park rangers but was closed after a series of strange disappearances in the 1980s. Some said Robbie may have stumbled upon something he shouldn't have: illegal poaching, drug operations, or even evidence of crimes long buried. If that were true, someone might have silenced him before he could tell anyone what he saw. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing idea of all came from a forensic pathologist who examined the skull. The bone fractures, though subtle, hinted at possible blunt force trauma. Not enough to confirm murder, but too irregular to ignore. That single clue shifted the investigation from an accident to something far more sinister. To Robbie's parents, these theories were both a comfort and a curse. They wanted answers, but every explanation carried its own form of heartbreak. His mother, now in her 70s, confessed in one interview that she often dreamt of Robbie still out there, not gone, just lost, as if he might one day walk through the front door, smiling the same shy smile she remembered. But as investigators reviewed old files, phone records, and faded maps, the same haunting truth remained. Every path led to uncertainty. Too many years had passed. Too much evidence had vanished. The forest had swallowed its secret long ago. And so, even with DNA confirmation and the skull identified beyond doubt, the question that had tormented a family for over 2 decades still lingered, not where Robbie Andrews had been found, but what really happened to him in those final, silent moments of 1998. Would the forest ever speak the truth? Or would Robbie's story remain, like so many before it, buried beneath the roots and moss of time, a whisper in the woods, lost to the wind forever? Years after the forest gave back what it had taken, the story of Robbie Andrews continues to linger in the quiet corners of people's minds like a chill that never quite fades. Even now, the trees that once stood witness to his final steps seem to whisper his name when the wind moves through their branches. For Robbie's family, closure never truly came. The small box that held what was left of their son was placed beside his grandparents in the town cemetery, a peaceful place, surrounded by oak trees and birdsong. Yet peace, for them, remained out of reach. His mother still sets a candle by her window every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. Not as a ritual of grief, but as a light for him in case, somehow, somewhere beyond this world, he's still searching for home. The discovery of his skull brought answers, but also heavier questions. What happened in those last hours? Did Robbie meet someone in the woods that day? Was he scared? Or did he still believe, even as the shadows closed in, that he'd find his way back? The thought of his youth frozen forever at 17 aches in the hearts of those who knew him. A boy who once dreamed of becoming a wildlife photographer, whose laughter used to echo down the school hallway, became a story that parents now whisper to their children as a warning. In town, the legend of Robbie Andrews became a quiet symbol of how fragile life is and how deep the forest can hide its truths. Some hikers still leave a small token when they pass the old trailhead where his trip began. A flower, a photograph, a note with his name. They say it's to remind him that he's not forgotten, that someone still remembers the boy who vanished under a wide summer sky. The sheriff who reopened the case in 2021 once said, "The forest doesn't forget, it just waits." His words, meant for the cameras, now carry a strange weight. Perhaps one day, someone will stumble upon a clue. An old camera, a piece of fabric, something that will finally tell Robbie's full story. Or perhaps, like so many who vanished before him, his truth will stay buried among the roots and silence. But if this story leaves anything behind, it's a message to those who wander, to those who love, and to those who search. Cherish every moment, every goodbye, every promise. Because life doesn't always end with warning or reason. Robbie's journey may have ended deep in the woods, but his memory lives quietly in his mother's lighted window, in the hearts of friends who never forgot, and in the hope that his story, even in its sorrow, might protect another from the same fate. And somewhere, perhaps in the gentle hush of the forest at dusk, his spirit still walks the trail he once loved, forever 17, forever searching for the way home. If stories like this move you, the ones that linger long after they end, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen. Every week, we uncover the forgotten, the mysterious, and the voices that vanished without a trace. Your support helps keep their stories alive,